An extremely controversial and by far the most peculiar to discuss version of the King of the Monsters is Godzilla in Hell, for a time regarded as the most powerful version of the character by far, then going through multiple enormous smear campaigns that lasted years, typically on idiotic sites like Reddit, for example. Not helped by bad YouTubers making disingenuous content about them. So today, I am going to lay out every single piece of evidence for why Godzilla in Hell is not only much stronger than you think, but is indeed the king of kings. Let's start with the basics. When dealing with someone like Godzilla in Hell, to be honest, I think viewing any finite things are kind of a waste of time. Let's talk about them briefly. So we know that he had a beam clash with Space Godzilla resulting in the destruction of the Earth, but it actually goes farther than that. Specifically mentioned by one of the writers from the comic that the explosion had a radius of 1,000,000 kilometers. That absolute bare minimum, Godzilla's outputting enough power to blow up dwarf stars. Slightly more in-depth numbers would get this figure all the way up into the large star figures. The planet bust is actually a solar system level feat. Yeah, leave it to Godzilla in Hell to turn something planet level into solar system level. What's more interesting, however, is the notion that Godzilla and Space Godzilla actually destroyed the entire realm, which clearly displays at the very least a number of stars. But given the context of Hell realms being most likely their own universal space-times, this is most likely a universal plus feat already. Are we going to use statements? Yes, but of course with their context. There are some really bad leading questions that were asked of the creatives during the time of the comic's release. But this barbaric and completely idiotic manner of thinking has never sat well with me. Why get rid of all when we could just get rid of the bad ones? It never made any sense. Now, of course, the statements will be added onto the scaling. They won't be all of the scaling. Even from the most basic point of view, we could already put Godzilla in Hell at a bare minimum low multiversal. An excellent friend of the channel, Headless Glenn, has already covered Godzilla in Hell from this perspective. But there is much more to this. Every single layer of Hell that Godzilla enters is in fact its own dimension. Infinitely large and with their own space-time, meaning that Hell in itself casually demonstrates well over 27 different dimensions. Heaven is able to war with Hell, so should be at least as powerful. By the end of the comic, it is stated that Godzilla has surpassed both, putting him well above 27 universes at an absolute bare minimum, most likely 54. But as mentioned, there's more. As is the case with many comic universes, the multiverse is not finite in the IDW Godzilla series. There are infinite timelines, infinite worlds, and infinite dimensions. Meaning, by default, Godzilla in Hell is Multiversal Plus. This is where we get into another notion that newer media has gotten a lot more attention for. In the subsequent series, Godzilla Rage Across Time, it is revealed that every single Godzilla within the IDW comics comes from a true form that exists beyond space, time, and the entire physical universe. This is how even after Godzilla was completely destroyed by Zeus, he just came back. Now, since this realm is beyond time and space entirely, this is objectively a fifth dimensional place. But what's more is we get a detailed explanation on Godzilla in Hell issue 3, which is the one in where Godzilla confronts Heaven and Hell directly, with the God Mountain and all. The author was asked to explain in detail how Hell and Heaven's cosmology works. That the same true form was contained within a quote-unquote universe, which is in itself in a greater world of universes that is more than infinitely greater than the realm itself. It is explained that there is no infinity within the material world, from the perspective of God and even the God Mountain, and that the only way to become truly infinite is to be within heaven or hell. This means at a bare minimum that heaven resides in an infinitely above infinite fifth dimensional space, more likely than not a sixth dimensional realm. Godzilla completely surpasses this sixth dimensional realm with his power-ups. But even more notable is the fact that God Mountain smacked his base form from heaven into hell, and he took 0 damage. Godzilla is hurt several times within this comic, suggesting that every single beast he faces is 6-dimensional in power, and he grows vastly stronger over the course of the comics, with each and every single challenge being stated to be utterly impossible for Godzilla to defeat previously, and then he simply just grows so much that he overcomes the challenge anyway. With an entire 6-dimensional realm manipulating the laws of its existence in order to become more powerful, in order to stop Godzilla, this means that he has some of the best power growth of any Godzilla, and some of the best I've seen within the realms of fiction. This is genuinely some Gurren Lagann stuff. And yet, we're still not done. Now, before I get into the more controversial section, I want to talk about the different interpretations by the 3 creatives responsible for issue 3 of Godzilla in Hell, where most of the godly scaling comes from. Ulysses Fariñas is one of the writers, and he seems to believe pretty much everything you've probably heard about Godzilla in Hell. He's insanely powerful, most likely equal to or above God, and he's given a lot of interesting implications, like the notion that the thing he might have taken down in issue 5 might be a Yog-Sothoth stand-in. Eric Freitas seems to have a slightly more conservative interpretation, with God at least creating the entire Godzilla multiverse, and Godzilla most likely being able to challenge him. The artist, Buster Moody, seems to prefer a more mythical, spiritual sort of interpretation, where Godzilla was able to take attacks from hell and heaven, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's more powerful physically, but rather through his willpower he overcomes heaven and hell. Either way though, they seem to come to a pretty similar conclusion, that Godzilla is at the very least on par with God, Satan, etc., and above bare minimum his own cosmology. The reason I say bare minimum is because the IDW comics have what's called a megaverse, where their different franchises are all encompassed in one greater space. Now, there are a few scans that can be interpreted as Godzilla being able to blow up the entire megaverse, but some authors have gone on to say that this would really only refer to their own works, that IDW themselves would have the final say on things. Which, to be fair, they haven't contrasted these statements at all, but absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. So just because IDW hasn't said he can't do it doesn't mean he automatically can. What is noteworthy though is the fact Godzilla does in fact have crossover with other parts of the megaverse. Recently, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and more famously, the Power Rangers. Other franchises contained within the megaverse have also crossed over, like My Little Pony and Transformers. So this should mean that they're all sort of in the same sort of areas. Power Rangers themselves, in their comic iterations, do also have an infinite multiverse in higher realms, like where the morphing grid is. When asked, the morphing grid was stated to be beyond the concept of time, space, and dimensions, which is similar wording to what's used for Rage Across Time Godzilla's true form. Some have interpreted this scan as automatically outerversal due to the question posed. Others don't like it because it's somewhat leading. Now, I do think that there are some very, very, very bad actors when discussing Godzilla in Hell, but you'll notice they tend to be really stupid kids, and pretty obvious when the authors are just mad or are just trolling with them. But they actually do answer questions honestly and sometimes in great detail. So this is why I will be using a number of these statements for Godzilla in Hell's strength. The megaverse is important because within the megaverse, is everyone's favorite RPG, Dungeons & Dragons. Now, because the megaverse does connect to all of its franchises, this means that higher up level beings would compare to things from Dungeons & Dragons, an incredibly powerful series in its own right, and there are many in-depth blogs discussing the power of the verse even from a conservative interpretation. I'll be linking a number of those in the description below because frankly it's too long to go into depth on in this video. Some smaller channels have also done the same, so I'll give them their props. In the world of Dungeons & Dragons, every single RPG is its own universe, canon to the series' greater multiverse. So if you yourself create a campaign with the Living Tribunal, SCP-682, Goku, Superman, whatever, that automatically becomes a single universe within D&D. So you can probably see where this gets pretty absurd. Above even the multiverse though are higher realms where gods reside. Gods and demons have been consistently estimated to be in the outer versal levels of strength. But why would Godzilla compare to such things? Well, there's actually versions of Godzilla in D&D already, and some of these are regarded as god slayers. So D&D's Godzillas would in fact be outer versal. But how does this scale back to Godzilla in Hell? Well, since they are in fact connected, and we know that the Godzilla series can branch off into different things, we can firmly say that GIH, being one of the last properties, and verbatim, the most powerful, should scale above at least D&D's Godzillas. Now, GIH Issue 1 blatantly says that the challenges of Hell are Godzilla's greatest challenges ever. So even the first layers of Hell are now, with cosmology context, bumped to outer versal, meaning even base form GIH is an outer versal entity. Official Divine used somewhat of the same arguments, but because, well, that guy doesn't do all that much research, it came across as weird to many people. Still though, props to that guy, he has some really good editing. Now for an even higher interpretation. There is in fact a version of Godzilla who blatantly overpowered an albeit earlier version of the D&D cosmology. D&D, being one of those growing series, would be constantly getting more and more impressive over time. So with Godzilla transcending an earlier version of D&D, it wouldn't be necessarily as impressive as later versions. Still though, characters like the Luminous Being, the god stand-in of the verse, were already present and insanely overpowered. And in this official magazine entry, it is stated that Godzilla is in fact more powerful than the world of Dungeons & Dragons can contain. In a similar vein, this same version of Godzilla managed to overpower an insanely mighty book series. The character, Bob, from the series Twin Peaks, is an insanely overpowered creature, yet, in this magazine entry, he was completely unable to do anything to Godzilla. So yes, Random Magazine Godzilla number 56 bullied not one, but two outer versal cosmologies. And this is lowballing. I've seen plenty of people argue these to be high outer and beyond. Yet, we have a blatant, official confirmation that base form Godzilla in Hell would just bulldoze this guy, as well as the D&D Godzillas. Then, as mentioned, he becomes much more powerful in a greater cosmology, eventually taking the powers of heaven and hell for himself, and surpassing even those in his natural state. And we also know that his growth hasn't finished, as when asked about his more mystical interpretation, the artist, Buster Moody, said that Godzilla's willpower can allow him to grow much more powerful at will, allowing him to surpass heaven and hell from a previously weaker state. So really, I see no reason why he wouldn't be able to just do that again in a fight. Now, I do think the higher end interpretations are actually the more consistent, due to all the context from this great cosmology. Some people don't like this, but those same people will automatically do the same for comic book characters. Even though, let's be honest here, most comic characters like Superman, a certain green guy that Godzilla may or may not be facing in a certain internet show, and more, tend to not really do super high cosmological feats themselves, but rather usually fight characters with that sort of scaling, or are just stated to have this ability. Godzilla in Hell is a little more limited in this regard because they wanted to be a bit more abstract with the text, which is usually why they got a bunch of questions regarding this stuff. But with the context in place, it does cement him as far as I see, the most powerful version of the Monster King. And you can argue even this is a lower-end interpretation, as some have argued that series like Marvel and DC are already consumed within the world of Dungeons & Dragons, which of course is in IDW, and Godzilla can blow up at the very least his own cosmology, possibly several others as well, was more powerful than early versions of D&D, steamrolls outer-versal characters. The list goes on and on. Oh, and for some reason, people tried to use a really goofy smear campaign that all of it was a dream. I mentioned this in the stupid Reddit bullying. Yeah, it got so bad that they asked the people who made the comics whether or not the comics were a dream, and no, they were confirmed to have really happened. So yes, as anyone who says JH is just a dream, so he scales nowhere, can shut the fuck up. In terms of speed, remember, he's crossing between realms that are confirmed to be infinite in size. If he's moving between infinite locations, he really can't be below any sort of high finite speed. Most likely this would just be infinite speed to anyone with brains. Of course, people going to bring up the fact that once you reach a certain level of dimensionality, or, as mentioned, higher than that, these realms are most likely not bound by time in the same way, meaning that the speed formula kind of breaks, and that would result in Godzilla in Hell having immeasurable to possibly irrelevant levels of speed. If you do accept to be honest, more consistent outer-versal scaling, he would have irrelevant speed. If you think he's more in the dimensional stuff, then he would likely be immeasurable speed, which is the speed at which you go back in time. As mentioned, the only Godzillas you can really argue get even close to GIH in his own stuff would be maybe Heisei Godzilla if you squint, as he's regarded as the most powerful within Toho's lineup, including in modern times, to which you can counter-argue that, IDW has a completely separate cosmology and structure, so more likely than not, Toho's statement wouldn't apply to the IDW comics, but there is the notion that the Space Godzillas in both comics have the same sort of origin. So you could argue that, at the very least, base GIH and later Heisei Godzilla have some relativity. There would also, of course, be, the Godzilla who bullied D&D in Twin Peaks, the Godzillas from D&D. Those Godzillas are most likely somewhat close to Godzilla in Hell in strength, except we know that they are weaker than even his base form. And there are, in fact, some mighty versions from other things, like card games, for example. Magic the Gathering is another insanely overpowered series, and they also had a crossover with Godzilla, where he is regarded as more powerful than even the Versus Dragons, who have some insanely nutty feats. Same is true of Battle Spirits, a card game in which Godzilla is displayed as an insanely powerful being, especially Godzilla Ultima, Void Ghidorah, and Heisei Godzilla, which makes sense. This seems to be the consistent narrative in the films too. So maybe you can get some Godzillas who are sort of sub-relative to GIH's cosmology, but the way it's lined up, it mostly seems like Godzilla in Hell stands in his own tier, really. Even his base form is outclassing most other versions of Godzilla, and even the ones that can contest with him, well, he would just get stronger right away. Now for some interesting abilities. With his god immortality form, which is the purple glowing one, he's able to reflect attacks back at the user so strong that they destroy themselves, and it's confirmed that absolutely nothing could hurt him at this point, boosting his durability and also giving him blatant invulnerability like a video game. And as long as he keeps the power to himself, nothing can truly defeat him. He is also blatantly mentioned a couple of times to be in existence similar to God himself, and having the potential to nearly do anything God can do. The same sort of omnipotence paradox question of, God making a rock so big even God can't lift it, is actually said for Godzilla, and he could just do it anyway. God Mountain displays the ability to manipulate minds, summon an army of angels, warp reality, open vortexes into hell, created the cosmology, and is regarded as a being who can utterly eliminate any sort of disorder from his realm, and is a being of pure faith, incarnate, and love. These sorts of abstract abilities are pretty consistent in different interpretations of God, and early on especially, God Mountain and God's Truth State were likened to the Abrahamic God directly. Lucifer Space Godzilla and God Demon, the two enemies from Hell, are also regarded in similar standing. Hell's beings also blatantly say that they can eat Godzilla's soul, and we also, again, know that Godzilla was formed from pure energy, above space, time, spirit, physical existence, etc. That, the aforementioned, to just will himself more powerful on some Gurren Lagann energy, immortality so great that even when blatantly killed in Hell, he just doesn't care, comes back, and starts beating the impossible challenges. We also are blatantly told by the writer of issue 5 that Hell actively nullifies your abilities, meaning your abilities don't work the way they want to in Hell, and only in the 5th issue, when confronted by God Demon directly, was Godzilla ever challenged by this. Even then, he just took Hell's power for himself, possessed its demons, surpassed his previous self, and won. So, yeah, not only is Godzilla in Hell insanely strong, but he's more than likely the fastest version of the Monster King too, due to his cosmology, and has an insane array of abilities and resistances. He would also just, scale to the various cosmologies in terms of abilities too, but again, that would be too long to talk about in detail. So, yes indeed, Godzilla in Hell is the most powerful version of the King of the Monsters. And really, I don't even think it's close. No other has as much dominance over their own world than GIH does. Fighting against the impossible, rising to any challenge. He conquered himself, he conquered heaven, he conquered hell, gaining a victory and a crown that no one can take from him. So maybe there is something human about the King of the Monsters.